Welcome back to Troubleshooting Agile. Hi there, Jeffrey.
Hi, Squirrel.
So I hear that you went skiing recently and you learned something that's relevant to our listeners. What might that be?
Well, I hope it's helpful for people. I had a rather painful, but maybe not totally painful, but definitely embarrassing experience skiing yesterday. And it had me thinking about the problems I've seen with learning in various teams. So the situation was I'm up in the hills of California, up in the one of the snowy passes to do some cross country skiing. And I don't know, Squirrel, if you ever done cross country skiing before?
I've never done any kind of skiing. I sort of know that something goes on your feet, but I don't, and you push. But I prefer to be in the cabin with the hot chocolate.
Right, right. Okay, that's very reasonable. But in cross country skiing, there's actually two different types of skiing. There's kind of two disciplines within what's called Nordic skiing. And one is kind of the old style, what people have done for a very long time, which is called classic. And this one, your kind of feet move backwards, forwards in a line. There's actually when they groom the trails, they make a little tracks for your skis to go on. And if you remember the exercise equipment called a Nordic track, which was a simulator of skiing, that's the kind of skiing it was simulating. There's another kind, a more modern kind, which is called skate style skiing. And in this case, it's more like you're on really long ice skates and you push your skis off to first one side and the other and you skate down the track. So in this case, you have a very relatively broad track and you skate along with these very long skis. And there's different skis and you use different poles and a different technique for the two styles. And for me and our friends, we might switch off between them. And this was my first time back on the snow this year, so I'd taken all of my gear and we got up. And then what happened is I expected things to be awkward because I hadn't skied for a while, and we went out in the morning, and I just had a really, really difficult time. I decided to start with classic skiing, and we went out, and I just things were fine when I was going downhill, but I struggled on the flats and uphill. It just didn't feel smooth, and I just felt like I just must have lost all of my muscle memory of how to do this. And that continued until about lunchtime, and we took a break. And as we started again, my wife asked me a question about my skis. She says, Jeff, aren't those your skate skis? And I said, no, I think they're my classic skis. But after conferring with a friend, I realized that actually I was totally wrong. It wasn't that I had forgotten how to do classic skiing. I'd forgotten what my classic skis looked like, and I had grabbed the wrong pair. And I had struggled all this time in the morning just because I was trying to use the equipment in the wrong way. I'd actually mismatched I had my classic poles and my skate skis and was trying to classic ski with skate skis and all of my struggles was from this foundational mistake I had made about the applicability of what I had to what I was trying to accomplish. And in thinking about our podcast, I realized I've kind of experienced some similar mistakes with teams where they're trying to take a technique and learn it, but they're applying it to the wrong type of problem. And this is a very different failure of learning I think it's an interesting one to discuss. So that's what I wanted to bring to here, Squirrel, and having heard about my embarrassing. And by the way, so I went and switched out my skis, and then it suddenly turned out, yes, in fact, I knew how to classic ski just fine if I simply had the right equipment. So, any thoughts come to mind for you as you hear my little tale of woe?
Well, a fantastic story, and certainly I've seen many teams in many disciplines, not only technology, struggle with the wrong tool. And the most classic sort of thinking error that I observe is something I call betterism, which we've talked about on the podcast before. Namely, someone reads something about, say, I don't know, the Spotify model for organizing your technology organization, and it's got all these charts and graphs, and it's coming from these clever people at Spotify who've been kind of successful. So it must be good, and so we'll go off and we'll use this thing we read about. but nobody has checked that the skis match the trail. Nobody has checked
Yeah.
that this thing is actually working. And if listeners know why we're laughing, it's because Spotify discovered very quickly that the Spotify model didn't work for them and didn't use it. However, it somehow leaked out, and a bunch of people said, well, it's got Spotify on it and looks cool, so we should try it too. And it turned out it was the wrong skis for them. So there are many cases where this has happened. Jeffrey, I wonder what your feeling was. What emotions did you have when the light dawned and you said, "Wait a minute, wrong skis"?
Mostly I was very, very embarrassed because this was something I allegedly, knew how to do. I had done before successfully, um, and in part, I often notice that people, mostly the failure to learn is that people don't see the problem is within themselves. They typically would say something like, oh, well, it turns out this skiing thing could never work, or maybe it could work for other people, but it couldn't work here. And they don't look for themselves as a source of error. I actually was looking to myself as a source of error, which is I assuming I had just forgotten how to do the technique correctly.
But it was the wrong part of yourself.
Yeah, exactly. I hadn't kind of gone back to the basics and checked my assumptions that were more foundational.
Your move
Yeah,
your feet
and
components, they were working just fine. There was no problem with that. The problem was in the
yeah,
ski selection department.
yeah. Exactly, and something that I allegedly knew, and it was something I couldn't imagine myself. And this is maybe the thing is I couldn't imagine myself having made this mistake. And if you'd asked me ahead of time, what are the odds? I would have dismissed it as a possibility. Of course I know my skis and what they're for, but that was of course completely mistaken. So definite embarrassment, especially after I had been asked about it and denied. So essentially, someone else had questioned. My wife had questioned my assumption, but I had thought that she was mistaken because of course, like how could I make that mistake? And so there was an element there also of having received what could have been a very big clue from someone else and dismissed it. So compounding my embarrassment.
And this reminds me of one of my favorite books, which is the Checklist Manifesto by Gawanda. We'll link in the show notes to it. But what he was finding was that extremely highly skilled surgeons who had 20, 30, 40 years of performing surgeries were forgetting a very basic technique called inserting a central line. I think I've got the right name for it. And it was like 4 steps. It was just certain things you were supposed to do. And they were certain they knew how to do it. Therefore, they didn't check. And so when he
Right.
introduced a checklist of the 4 things, people actually remembered to do all the 4 things. And then they said, I don't need this checklist because I remember them. And he reminded them that they had forgotten a lot.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
the point is actually interesting. When you're more skilled, it can be more likely that you will forget something important that is very foundational because you think you can't forget it.
Yeah. That's a really good point. I remember the examples from the book and the huge reduction in infection rates in hospitals after the introduction of the checklist. Um, and yeah, and you're right that this interesting element of how even skilled, experienced people can make these kind of mistakes of omission, and in part that's just the way our minds work. And I often, the thing that occurs to me is how people who aren't paying attention are a lot like an LLM, which
Ah,
is they can
large
sound
language model,
very.
AI, go on.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. They can be very much like a AI where they sound very persuasive and very fluent, but the logic of what they put out can miss some fundamental steps and have maybe even some some confabulations that happen just because they aren't attending to that at the moment. Certainly at the time when I was selecting my skis, part of what happened, and this is we'll bring in another kind of embarrassing part about this, I had left my ski boots back at the cabin when we got there, and so I was actually at the time I was pulling my skis out of the truck, my mind was in the rental shop where I would needed to go rent some boots. So I was not really attending to the task that I was doing. My mind was elsewhere, which I'm sure contributed to my foundational mistake in the beginning. And humans are like that. You can imagine how a surgeon who is uh, um, going to be performing an operation, might have their head focus going ahead to what they consider to be the difficult part, and sort of the more basic preparation parts might uh, might not be receiving their full attention.
That's why listeners might want to be watching out for cases where their teams suddenly reduce in their skill level. So somebody who's been doing very well suddenly becomes less skilled. That's a signal that there might be something foundational going on, just like Jeffrey's skis were wrong. Jeffrey wasn't lacking in skill. Jeffrey can ski just fine, 1,000 times better than me. I want to sit in the chalet, but he had a fundamental problem that he wasn't noticing and was blind to. And in fact, someone who was less skilled, like me, might come along and say, "Boy, your skis don't look like the others. Why are is that so that you can ski better?" And he would have said, "Oh, wait a minute, not so good." This is
But
where
by
consultants can be
chance.
by chance.
Well, I think you're going exactly where I was going, exactly. But it's the getting someone who's experienced can help out to be that extra set of eyes. Sorry,
And
you were
not
saying
even
about
necessarily
consultants.
experienced. I don't know
Yes.
how great your wife is at skiing. She's probably fantastic. But an unskilled person, also from the outside, having a look can be helpful. And I'll say this, one of the most common recommendations I make in technical due diligence is get somebody from the outside, either hire someone, bring in a consultant, have someone review this area of your software, because nobody's looked at it in a while. And the people who are working on it have been doing it for a long time. That's a danger signal. So having only internal people who are sort of breathing their own exhaust means that you haven't had anyone look at your skis and say, hang on a second, new skis have been invented that can do both. Would you like to try those? Hang on a second. It looks like your skis are on the wrong feet. Have you noticed that? And I've found all kinds of those equivalent problems in technology teams as a result of coming in from the outside, not necessarily being an expert. I have clients
Yeah.
in areas that are totally outside my experience. I have some who are working with quantum mechanical uh, 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 objects and materials on silicon chips. I have some who build rockets and get them into space. I don't know anything about these things, but I can turn up and say, I really think that if you haven't heard from your engineers in 2 months, you might want to increase your or decrease your cycle time, right? And,
Yeah.
and those are the kinds of patterns and ideas that you can get from bringing in someone who may not be an expert in that specific area, but will have a different perspective.
Yeah, it's really good. What you sparked two thoughts in me as you were describing that. One is um, when I've done pair programming, it's with people who are less experienced, particularly with the code base that we're in. They can often ask very interesting questions that lead to changes. Well, why? Something that's fundamental is like, well, why is the variable named that? Why is
Mm-hmm.
this the name of the claim of a class? They have because they're less familiar. They're paying more attention to things that I might be overlooking just because I'm familiar with them. On the other hand, you mentioned consultants and getting more expert help. I actually yesterday was also a day that a friend was at the slopes, getting certified as an instructor. They were getting their level one uh, um, ski instructor, cross country ski instructor certification, and it was a very formal process where they went out for like a 3 hour um, uh, ski with someone who is the certification person who's the top level ski instructor who can certify people. And afterwards, there was a formal write up that took the instructor of the instructor about an hour to write up, and then they went through the feedback together. And one of the elements that the person was getting feedback on their own teaching was that they needed to improve some of their feedback on people's like biomechanics, which can be very difficult to do. Um, it, but the idea is that someone here who's a skilled, in this case, consultant of skiing, should be able to look at what's happening and be able to give people relevant feedback. Um, they're looking at something more more fundamental than, you've got the wrong skis. That, hopefully that was not the most difficult part of it for an instructor, but rather, sort of elements of body positioning and how people are moving. And there's that difference between him as a skier, where he had very positive feedback on his form and his technique, but the ability to give relevant feedback to people as they're making mistakes is an area that he needs to work on. Um, Perfectly adequate for a level one instructor, but that's his area of growth. So the going back here, the value on both sides of getting advice from outsiders, even a beginner, can give you relevant feedback. Someone who's not caught within your own set of assumptions, someone who will pay more attention to things that because they're less familiar with. And then second is the idea of people who've actually practiced attending to, as you said, like patterns of common mistakes, are able to spot them much better and give you relevant feedback. Yeah, all in the above would have been helpful to me. And in fact, the only reason I discovered the mistake was one of these examples of having the outsider, of having my wife say, those really do seem like the wrong skis to me. Um, so that I think is a very relevant generalization from the specifics of my ski blundering to the relevance of people in their teams and organizations.
There we go. Well, Jeffrey, we're at time, but I think there's some more very interesting material to discuss there, especially on the other side. So we've been talking about the learner, the person who is trying to do the action, and how that person might benefit from some outside points of view. But your story about your friend makes me think about how much it's helpful to a teacher to have some outside points of view, and how some teachers aren't very good at it. Should we come back next week
Yes.
and talk about that maybe?
Yeah, I think that's a great segue.
Excellent. Let's do that. So, listeners, if you're trying to learn, here's some. We've just given you some ideas for the sorts of things you might make mistakes with, and given you some tips like checklists and going outside to help with that. What have you done to try to improve your learning? And if you are having trouble with it, where do you think you might need some help? We would sure love to hear from you about that. We'd also love to hear from you if you think checklists suck, or if you think people should just suck it up and learn and pay attention to their skis. So if you disagree with us, we like that too. The best place to get in touch with us to share that disagreement is at agileconversations.com. There you'll find our book, Agile Conversations. You'll find lots of free material from us. You'll find videos and guides for conversational dojos and all kinds of other good things, as well as email and Twitter. And I don't know, are we on Sora? I don't know, but we're probably on lots of different things. And we do read all of those. We can't respond to all of them, but we do read what you send us, and we're always very interested. So please get in touch with us there. And of course, the other way to keep in touch is come back next week when we'll be skiing again. Rather, I will be sipping something hot, and Jeffrey will be out on the slopes. And that will be next week when we'll have another episode of Troubleshooting Agile. Thanks, Jeffrey.
Thanks, Squirrel.